Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everyone. We are so excited here at the podcast that we just surpassed 3 million listens, 3 million streams. It is really quite incredible. Since the beginning of this podcast, it has grown so exponentially, and it is very gratifying that so many people are drawn to it and are listening and are receiving support and education and some guidance and being able to learn about how this all happens. But also, if you yourself have dealt with something like this, for a lot of people who tell me this, the podcast has helped them no longer feel alone. That makes me very happy. And thank you also this past week to all of our listeners in the US and Canada and the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Poland, and Finland. It's quite incredible. So many different countries, so many places that are so far away. And that is very exciting. So, as always, let me know what speaks to you and why it is that you feel drawn to this podcast while you're living somewhere far away and different in the world. And so, for this week, we have the pleasure of speaking with Nikki G. Nikki G is a certified trauma recovery coach who helps survivors recover and thrive after religious trauma and cult involvement. She is also a survivor of multiple narcissistic relationships, religious trauma, as well as a former member of multiple cultic communities. Nikki is the CEO of Nikki G Speaks LLC, which exists to support survivors with individual coaching services, an online community, and other various forms of psychoeducation related to religious trauma, narcissistic abuse, and cult involvement. Nikki is also a co-host of the podcast Surviving the Black Church, where she and her co-hosts delve into conversations regarding religious trauma in the Black Church. She and another colleague have just recently founded the Black Religious Trauma Recovery Network, which is a resource to educate, support, and empower Black religious trauma survivors. Nikki also sits on the board of directors for Tears of Eden. And you can find more information on Nikki and her work at www.nikkiggspeaks.com. Here's Nikki G now. I am delighted to have Nikki G with me today. There's so much for us to talk about, and I think we'll get through as much as we can today, and we might need to have a part 2 or 3 or 7. There's a lot to cover, if that's okay with you. You have a lot of expertise and a lot of exposure, being in the room when it happened, kind of exposure, and which I think is really, really powerful to a lot of things that are being planned that are really good for people to know about. So take a moment if you can and introduce yourself, and then we'll start talking.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm glad to be a part of this podcast today with Rachel. My name is Nikki G. And first and foremost, I'm a survivor of a narcissistic family system, but I'm also a survivor of a lot of religious trauma and multiple cults. I was a part of 5 different cults in my journey of life. Even though I know I look like I'm 19, I get that all the time. But I feel like I've lived a full life so far. And this was not something that I planned on doing with my life as far as the work that I'm doing. But eventually, after I started sharing my story and sharing some of the modalities that were helpful to me to heal from being a part of several different cults and narcissistic relationships and families, 2020, I decided to actually do something about it. And I went to get some training with the International Association of Trauma Recovery Coaches and more training after that to be able to help survivors who have come out of these type of experiences. So coach, but I also share what I've learned, what I've experienced, and I really, really enjoyed connecting with the survivors. Survivors of any type of abuse or trauma are often put to the side, discarded by society, looked down upon, and many people leave them in those periods where it's the most lonely, it's the most confusing. And that's where I like to meet people right there and let them know what happened to you was not your fault. You still have worth and intrinsic value. You still have beauty that you can offer for yourself and those around you. And I like to support survivors right in that space. So I do that through coaching, I do that through educating, and I do that through speaking. So that's me.
That's a lot. So I'm curious. Also, you mentioned 5 different cults. Can you list them so I know what you were involved with?
Most of the cults were not very big and famous. A lot of them were mostly small cults that you couldn't pull up on the internet
Yeah,
now.
which is most of them, actually.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the first cult I was a part of, I put an asterisk on this. I consider my family my kind of first cult.
Uh-huh.
This is
Right,
how I
right.
got programmed and things of that nature. The second one, it was a ministry called Honey's Child Ministries. This was in New Jersey. This is where I'm a native from. So I was a part of that, and that was predominantly a Black ministry. The second one I was a part of was, I left there in New Jersey and I eventually migrated to Kansas City, and I was a part of the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. And that kind of gave me almost, it was like a gateway to subsequent cults. It was a gateway to several different ministries. So the ones I'm going to name are the brick and mortar cults that I attended, but there were several more that I was heavily connected to online as well. But these are the brick and mortar. So from there, I attended something called Menorah Ministries. It was also in Kansas City, small, little type of ministry. I don't even think it's in existence to this day right now. They were mostly about talking about the end times, prayer and intercession for America, prayers for Israel, things of that nature. I was somewhat of a leader in that place. And then there was the one called Eagles Gates Ministries, which was also in Kansas City, which was also a smaller ministry, which I think that was the one that really broke the camel's back for me. I would say it caused the most harm. It was smaller, it was more communal, I would say more than the other ones, but there was this romanticism with martyrdom. There was this romanticism with surrendering and laying everything down. There was this elitism that we were chosen ones in the city of Kansas City to intercede between God and the evil forces in Kansas City and push them back and things of that nature. And I don't know if I want to use the word necromancy, but there was a lot of spiritual activity where the leaders claimed that different prophets that were in the Bible were coming into the meetings. And, if you can imagine what that was like. And then there was one, this was not brick and mortar, but it was just as impactful. It was called World for Jesus Ministries. I believe that is still functioning to this day. This was unique. Okay. This was different. It was not brick and mortar, but this was the impactful one. And it was more geared around intercession and worship and spiritual warfare, and they would go to different strategic places in the United States, sometimes overseas as well. And we would intercede and push back the darkness, so to speak. It would be week long gatherings during this time. And worship was a high point. It would be 3, 4, 500 people. But then we would merge the worship with time of education where we were literally watching conspiracy theory videos on the teleprompter and then taking notes and interceding in these different things. So it was a merger of the prophetic, intercession, conspiracy theory cults. And then when we were not meeting during the weeks, we would connect by phone 2 or 3 times a week with intercession and things of that nature. So I connected with a lot of the leaders. I was there not as long as the other cults, but there's so many different markers to go into proving that. But we don't have 5 hours of time to do that. But yeah, so those were
Wow.
the major, and then there were other ones that were impactful, but not as impactful as these 5 main ones in my life.
My goodness. Oh my goodness. You have experienced so much. And you can also see how groups that many people have never heard of can be just as dangerous, sometimes more so in that there is zero oversight. No one knows what's going on because they haven't really even heard of it. And then a leader that wants to get away with things really can, right? And then also the fact that you had to deal with these places that were going to make you, it sounds like, make you feel that you had certain powers or make you afraid of different things, with the whole spirit realm or Armageddon or spiritual warfare.
Hmm.
The idea of spiritual warfare is also really interesting because a lot of people have said to me, we were involved in what we thought was spiritual warfare. But after I left that church, I felt I had been in the war, that there had been spiritual warfare against me. And so I didn't know if we did anything out there, but I feel like I was in the trenches. I feel like I survived something. I feel like I was traumatized, like I was in a war, which is interesting.
Hmm. I mean, my dream life when I was a part of these cults totally different than it is now. I could sleep at night. Back then, it was not, because everything was always warfare. There was always some mission that we had to fulfill for the cause of Christ. There was always something going on in the city or in the nation. And the way a lot of these cult leaders would put things is that God wants to move, but he's waiting on you. So a lot of that onus, a lot of members took upon themselves, and it caused a lot of sleep deprivation. It caused a lot of, I am not a clinician, so I can't say, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people experience psychosis, hallucinations, things of that nature, and then this whole pseudo personality that is erected in order to exist in these
Right.
spaces.
Right, right. Incredible. There is a conference I recently gave the keynote speech at. Is the National Association of Social Work conference. I was invited to speak, and it was in Little Rock, Arkansas, was where the conference was. I'd never been to Arkansas. And what was interesting was, well, I the social workers there were so impressive, and dealing with marginalized communities within marginalized communities and shoestring budgets and needing to work against the social constructs of people really having biases against certain people they're trying to protect. So they're up against a lot, and I give them a lot of credit. But what was interesting after I gave my talk, and yeah, of course, it's going to talk a little bit about spiritual abuse and other things, which I want to get more into with you before we go on to other things, that there were a number of people, specifically women, but I know this doesn't just happen to women, but it happens more so, who were saying to me, kind of asking me, how come when you were talking about what helps people come out of these things, you didn't mention the word forgiveness? And I said, it's not something that comes to mind. And they said, "Oh no, that's the thing that's helped us." And maybe the next time you give this talk, you can talk about a healing modality being forgiveness. So I said, "Well, tell me about why that's important to you." And these specifically 3 women who were raised in churches in this different areas of the South, but it doesn't just happen to be the South, said that their whole community was really tied to the church. And when they were abused by someone within the church, they needed to go to the counseling service or whatever it was within the church, and nothing happened to the person who did this to them, but they were told that they had to forgive, that that was going to be a part of their healing. And finally, after the second story, that this third person came up and said, "Yes, I was sexually abused by my deacon." And so I went to, a person who said that she was available to speak to me, and she gave me some Bible passages about, forgiveness. And I had heard this already, and I couldn't stop myself. I don't ever want someone to feel criticized in the way they're healing themselves, right? But I said, "What happened to the deacon?" And she said, What do you mean?" Like, that wasn't even considered in some of these places, not all, but in some. Like, that what? She didn't even quite understand the question, and she said, "Oh, he's fine." Like, somehow I'm asking about his health, like, "Is he okay?" Like, I care, right? No more. I might have cared before the story, but not anymore.
Right, right.
And that was fascinating. So, like, this kind of passivity too that is enforced on you, where there's no justice, you don't have a voice, nothing happens to the perpetrator, the victim is told how to change their way of thinking about it. That was fascinating to me, just how repeated that was. And I thought, these poor people are like sitting ducks, really, really dangerous.
hmm I call forgiveness as a healing modality. I call it the F word. It's as potent as the F word can be in certain spaces. That's how it can be to a survivor of religious trauma, cults, and things of that nature. There's a whole history, and we can get into that now or later, as to why, particularly in the Black community, that is probably, at the top of the list as this is how you heal. I went through that when I was, dealing with coming out, and everything was push forgiveness, forgiveness. And I'm not against that. For some, they may feel like, this is what I need to do. Even with my clients, that is something I don't push. If it is brought up, we can work through that. But I often encourage them to, if you're going to forgive, let's start with you first, right? And there is a timing when you bring that word up. We talk about people being trauma informed, but I'm really big on trauma sensitive. Why are we saying for someone to forgive an abuser and they just told their story? This just happened 2 weeks ago. This just happened a day ago. And oftentimes you may see stories on the news, different terroristic type of people going in, shooting up a Black church, shooting up a grocery store, and the news media will have the microphone in someone's face, a Black person, and what do you think about this? And oftentimes you'll hear, well, God wants us to forgive. There's no processing of the event. Most of the time, people are still in shock, and there's a lot to it, but it can be used to invalidate people's experiences. It can be used to spiritually bypass accountability, oftentimes in any community, but especially in our community, because you don't talk about what you've been through in the Black church, in the Black community. You got out of it, you survived. That's good. Keep going. Don't bring up the past.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's what it is, you think,
hmm
for Black churches by and
hmm
large. I know,
Right, right, right.
when we talk about kind of a title of things, we're not saying this is true for every single person in every single place, but by and large.
Absolutely.
So this is a goal, because what is there, this sense that it's going to do or protect people from, or why is that?
Well, I mean, you have the other aspect of in a lot of Black community, which offsets to the Black church, they're almost one and the same to some degree. There is this notion, and again, a lot of these things I'm bringing up oftentimes are not spoken about, they're not talked about at large, right? But there is this notion that love and abuse coexist. So if you believe that someone sexually assaulting you, someone spiritually manipulating you, someone verbally abusing you from the pulpit in front of everybody, if your body feels it and you tighten up and you know this doesn't feel right, but then you hear everyone else, the church mothers that say, just turn the other cheek. If you want God to forgive you, you have to forgive this person. And so the lines get blurred, and generations of Black people, Black Americans, not everybody, but oftentimes grow up without even knowing that we have this belief system that love and abuse coexist, and they do not. So a lot of times recovery looks like, well, what is love? What are the components of a healthy form of love from your church, from your pastor, from your parents, from your neighbor, from Uncle John? And what does abuse look like? And there's a spectrum, I understand that, but in totality, what does it look like until we start educating and actually sifting through and doing that psychoeducation? You can have reality checks, but it's not registering because there's a lot of indoctrination from slavery to a lot in the Black church, from historical trauma, from, systemic racism. There's a lot of intersectionality that goes into it. So, in other words, it's complex.
It's complex, right?
Yeah.
Multi-layered. And it comes, I mean, very often a lot of these ideas that end up really being handicapping in so many ways are woven in for safety originally, right? And then they end up undermining people's safety at some point. It's like how I think, abuse, neglect, all of it is underreported in a lot of religious communities or certain family systems because that is love. Or it's in some Eastern philosophy cultic groups, that's your karma. It's just all explained away. And then you might not know why you don't want to be touched. You might not know why you're having nightmares, because you're just being shown love. That's very confusing.
Right. And even when it comes to, religious trauma, spiritual abuse, cults, within the Black community, there's a lot of psychoeducation that has to go into it before you can even get to anything else. Because, like I said earlier, we've been indoctrinated to believe that this is a nothing burger, so to speak. This is a part of how we've survived. This happened to grandma. This happened to Aunt Carolyn. So, and they still remained in the church. They still remained within the family, and that abusers hung around. So why am I saying anything about it? Why is it more difficult for me? And so we learn, unfortunately, to just take it, to just bear it. And oftentimes, where do those stories reside? In our bodies. Unprocessed grief, unattended grief, all of that resides in our body. And then, you deal with, the DNA, and it's passed down, and it's cyclical, and it becomes such a major problem.
Right. Absolutely. And I think just before we get into more of your experiences and also the coaching that you're doing and the podcast and what you're covering there, I think to get a working definition of spiritual abuse, because some people might not know what that is and how it is the same as certain kinds of abuse and how it stands out as different. And so if you can take us through that, that would be great.
Yeah, and I'm going to give more of a definition as a survivor. I'm pretty sure you can articulate this even better than myself. But as a survivor, what spiritual abuse felt like to me, and I'm just going to be a little graphic, but it felt like someone taking a machete and cutting off my umbilical cord between me and God, or me and my creator, or me and higher power. And obviously unsolicited, but now how do I connect spiritually anymore when this has happened? When you think about domestic assaults, you think about, physical assaults, there are wounds, there is evidence. You can go to the police if you desire. You can report these things. But when you've been spiritually manipulated by a pastor, by a parent, by a friend, by a guru. And when you've been spiritually manipulated and your whole will and your thinking has been hijacked, where do we go? Like you said, we can't report it at this present moment, at least here in the States. I think some states are doing some work to see coercive control become more criminal. And I'm like, yay for that. But for the most part, if you have, and I'm working on being able to coach adolescents and get a certification with adolescents, because man, do they go through spiritual abuse in the Black family, in the Black church, who do we report to? You know what I mean? If it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, you know what to do with that. But when it's religious and spiritual abuse, who do you go to? The laws in society have not caught up to this, but this has been happening for decades, you know? But spiritual abuse, it robs you of your ability to connect spiritually. You know, a lot of people after they've experienced this form of abuse, they're not the same. It hits every facet of life, and recovery, you know, looks like hitting every facet of life. You know, it can affect you cognitively, it can affect you socially, it can affect you sexually. You know, your sexuality. It can affect how you see yourself, how you see others, and for most people, if they've been through trauma and abuse outside of this area, they can go to their higher power. They may be able to go to a church for respite and encouragement. But when this happened to you at that place, it's almost like I've got a gunshot wound, but I can't go to the hospital because the doctors and the nurses have assaulted me there. So what do I do? I'm being graphic intentionally because I don't think people really understand from a survivor's standpoint how it impacts us. And you have people that are still trying to navigate this years later. I am doing this work, but I am still a survivor. I still have my therapist. I still have areas that I am working for towards with healing and recovery, and that's okay. I don't have the proverbial healing watch on that says, okay, Nikki, it's been X amount of years. You should be good now. You know, I don't, you know. And I mean, healing for me is it's an evolution anyway. It's not a moment in time. It's not a book. It's not being at, you know, a prayer line. It's not, you know, sitting in front of a therapist and all of a sudden it's like poof, they just go like, no, that's not what it is. You know, I get to evolve. I get to find a higher version of myself. I get to really find out who Nikki is as I'm recovering. It's not all gloom and what I've been through. It's what I can be despite what I've been through.
Oh, I love that. And, you know, I think with the people I talk to who have a really, really difficult and confusing time, they have the situation of having been abused and their families, sometimes their parents, are still believers, don't believe them that it happened, or tell them to keep it quiet so they don't bring shame unto the family or to the church. And so they're kept kind of from ever being able to say, this is what happened to me and getting help with it. But, you know, for there a lot of people who will still believe, like I'm thinking of this particular church group, La Luz del Mundo, that has been in the news, that a lot of the girls who were abused in every way by the leader, by the pastor, some of their families are still in and believe this leader, who is now in jail, is still a messenger of God, still to this day. And they feel like they have no one. You know, they've had to kind of adopt people as surrogate parents so they can feel protected out there in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard for people to navigate that because usually people don't exit cults or high demand groups in droves. It usually doesn't happen that way. It's usually one by one, and a lot goes into that. You know, you have to work through leaving here sometimes before you can physically walk out of these spaces. That is the hard part. You know, I still have people that I know and love, and they look at me like, "What are you doing?" You know, you were Miss Prophetess, you were Miss, you know, Intercessor, you all these things. What are you doing? You know, and in the Black community, you hear a lot of you're outside of the church. How does that work? You know, you're going to be given over to Satan's devices that way. You become part of his playground. I've been through church hurt, and I want to get to that too. And your daddy's been through church hurt, and your grandma, and we're still in God. We're still in the church. So you need to come back where there's safety. I understand that's what happened to you, but God is God. And if Jesus could tell people to turn the other cheek, if he can be nailed to the cross, certainly you can move through this and come back because this is where safety is. So you see how a survivor can live in cognitive dissonance when they hear this, and not just the one time. You've heard it in the family, in the Black community. You've heard it in the church. You've heard it on, the radio, on Instagram, or social media. You're hearing it everywhere, and so for a Black a religious trauma survivor, cult survivor, spiritual abuse survivor to leave, it takes a lot. I am done. No more. And obviously, the number one reason is I don't feel safe here. This is not safety. I tried as long as I could, but I am almost dying on the inside. This is not what safety is now. I see what I'm in. I don't understand it, but I will rather deal with what's out there than to remain in here. And you're finding a lot of millennials and Gen Zs are the ones that are saying that more so than the older generation.
Ooh, interesting. I'm curious to hear about that because that really is like, it's like willful blindness, right? Like, you know, um, come back. This is where you're safe. Even though all these other things happen, we're going to put blinders on because we don't want to see it. Maybe we're not ready to look at it.
That's what it is too.
And maybe it'll help our cognitive dissonance if you come back. Yeah. That's so interesting. So sometimes people are doing it for themselves.
Yeah.
Wow. So tell me, and I want to hear about church hurt and the millennials and
Oh,
Gen
yeah, yeah,
Zs.
yeah, yeah,
Ooh,
yeah,
so
yeah,
many
yeah.
things.
Yeah,
Good.
whatever you wanna do.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's go. Because you said you wanted to get back to the idea of church hurt. So let's talk about that.
I'm pretty sure with your expertise in what you do, you've heard this terminology before, church hurt. And, unfortunately, that is used more in the Black community. I don't have statistics to compare it, but in the Black church, the conversation's starting a little bit. So I give some credence to, okay, there's some conversation, but it's basically been relegated more to the term church hurt. Now, you being, who you are in your field, when you hear church hurt, there's probably a whole lot of, reasoning and definitions. But a lot of times, what it is projected to be is, in my opinion, it is spiritually bypassing the major religious trauma and abuse that is happening in these places. So kind of how I view it is, you got church hurt, adverse religious experiences, and then you have major religious trauma, cults, high demand groups. And so what is going on is they're lumping all of that under the terminology of church hurt. And this is what I thought when I was in the cults that I was in. It's kind of like, baby, a little church hurt. Like I said, grandma and us went through that. We didn't walk away from God. We didn't turn him loose. We stayed in those places because his church hurt. He can heal that. And so I suffered in many of the spaces I was in because it was, well, this is an attack of the enemy. He's just trying to get me into church hurt and be so hurt that I forget that I am a watchman on the wall. I'm forgetting that I am his intercessor. I'm forgetting of the call of God on my life. I'm going to shake this church hurt off and I'm going to remain flat footed in this position and I'm not letting the devil take me out. Now, this is Black church talk. I'm not saying this nowhere else, but this is Black church talk. And so you will basically indoctrinate yourself and you rationalize staying and remaining in these places. Now, some people, they may have a little church hurt. And I'll give you an example. So let's say I talk to the worship leader and one Sunday, he said, and I say, hey, next Sunday when the choir sings, can I sing such and such song? Oh, yeah, you got a good voice. I think you'd be good for that. Okay, great. Okay, choir rehearsals on Wednesday. Come on out and we'll work through it. Okay, great. I'm all excited. I'm practicing on the way to work, at home. I'm excited to sing the song. I get to choir rehearsal on Wednesday. I walk in, I'm about 5 minutes late, and someone else is on stage with the choir, and now they're singing the song that he said that I could lead. So I'm a little taken back, and I'm like, well, I don't say anything. I go and just fall in line. And the whole rehearsal, he doesn't say anything to me. And he proceeds to allow this other person to practice and to lead. And they sang that song that Sunday. Never had a conversation with me about any of it. And so a normal reaction will feel slighted, maybe rejected, hurt. Like, hey, what's happening here? But the question is it at the, because, trauma has a lot to do with how it impacts us, right? So I may go home from that situation and feel a little slighted. Maybe the first night I'm uneasy and I can't sleep, but for the most part, I'm still able to function. I'm able to sleep going forward. I'm not having flashbacks 3 or 4 months later from this, right? So I was hurt. That's real. That happens in churches. That happens in business meetings. That happens all over the place. We get hurt. But we're talking about religious trauma where there's emotional, physical, psychological, responses to these belief systems that we're indoctrinated with. We're talking about where there's abusive practice going on and people can't function after that. And so within the Black church, church hurt is used, but they're using that to also be the label for abuse. You've been sexually abused by the deacon, they're calling that church hurt. And many parishioners are feeling like, well, I was hurt, but God forgave me and the mistakes that I made. So I'm going to forgive that deacon and keep moving forward. So you don't hear the terminology of abuse, spiritual abuse. You don't often hear the terminology of religious trauma. So a lot of people remain in these spaces because they don't understand the severity of it.
Wow. That is so interesting. Thank you so much. That's so clear about how it all gets lumped together and how it gets kind of dismissed then because church hurt doesn't really sound like much, you know? Like, okay, I bumped into I bumped into a pew, I got church hurt, right? Like it could be anything. But there is something so interesting about really minimizing, right? And I think that's what people take to even their therapists, like, well, yeah, it happened. I mean, it's okay. Qualifying it is like not such a big deal. But in order for you to care about what happened to you, you probably have to push through also caring about yourself. It's not pride. If you feel you've been hurt and you've been wronged, just getting through all of that, I'm sure is very, very confusing.
Yeah, and throughout all of that, the authentic self is, there are more clouds, is becoming diminished. You don't see who you really are anymore because now you're in survival mode. Even though it was termed church hurt, your body knows it was more than church hurt, You don't feel comfortable anymore when you go back to church. There's a hesitancy. You sit in the car a little bit longer because you're crying because you have to know, you have to go in, but you don't want to go in, but you continue to subject yourself to this because your family's there. Your husband attends the church. Who are you to say that there's something wrong? But this has been eating at you for months. And that describes a lot of survivors within the Black church. There's a statistic by the Pew Research Center, and 8 out of 10 Black Americans identify as Christians. 8 out of 10. We represent the most religious race within this country. So we are attending weekly, sometimes bi-weekly to these services. Christianity is a part of the fabric of the Black community in America, and this tracks all the way back to slavery. This tracks all the way back to when we were brought over and we were forced to give up other forms of spirituality and different practices that we had, and Christianity was now imposed on us. So that connection, that bond, that trauma bond with the oppressor, with now this religion. And then we had to attend some of the services until we were allowed to have our own under the same umbrella as our oppressors. They are thanking God that they have, the enslaved. And we're told to connect with the same religion and the same God. But then there's another connection, which is, during that time, they did not want us to learn to read and write. I think a lot of people know that. But for many that secretly learned to read and write, the Bible was the first book. that they cut their teeth on. So the connection to the church, the connection to the scriptures in the Bible, it has a whole nother level of bonding for us. And then we taught others in the Black community how to read from the scriptures. So imagining somebody going through some of the things we've already expressed and the levels of bonding that they would have to mentally and emotionally come out of is astounding.
Wow. I never thought about that, about the Bible being this, like when you're saying cutting your teeth on, like if it is your avenue for literacy, being able to, show that you're smart, right? Because if you can't read or write, it's hard to show that in this world, in, our culture. It shouldn't have to be, it's just reliant on that, but it often is. And it's a symbol of independence, strength, all of it. And so then if the Bible's tied in with all that can make you feel good or more free, it's going to be a very powerful heart connection to this. Yeah.
And the thing about it is the version of the Bible that many enslaved were able to connect with or were able to ascertain was something they call now the slave Bible. So a lot of passages were omitted from this version of the Bible, passages where you saw God talking about delivering his people, like in the Old Testament, with Moses, the deliverer, delivering the Israelites from bondage, things that talked about freedom. A lot of that was omitted, but what remained was slaves, obey your masters, submit to your leaders. So the psychological damage, and then this continued in the DNA of our people. And now that's the scriptures, but when you look at the institution of the Black church, out of the institution of the Black church came writers and singers and engineers and dancers and artists and, journalists. And so we looked at the Black church during that time as a place of resilience and strength and community and connection and politics. A lot of politicians came out of, think of people like Frederick Douglass and writers. And so prolific, awesome Black individuals emerged from the Black church. But what it was then and what it has morphed into be now are two totally different things. And I understand why we held on to that institution because it helped us to survive some of the most horrific times in history in America. But it has morphed into something different now. And many people are starting to say, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Does not represent safety anymore.
So you call it the slave Bible. So the slave Bible had the pieces taken out about freedom, about deliverance. That is fascinating. I mean, it's
Yes.
timely for us to be having this conversation now with Passover coming up. And, it's an interesting thing with celebrating Passover, which is something I do at my home, that there's this part of the Seder, the kind of, it's Seder means order, but just the order of it, where you ask what are called the four questions. And what I've loved about that is that it's not the four answers, it's the four questions. Like we get to ask questions and we can have different answers. Let's talk about it. But that's a symbol of freedom, right? Just like being able to read and write. And what is so interesting too is, oh God, I remember learning about this very sick thing with, like with our profession in its infancy. There are a lot of people who were diagnosed, mostly mothers, of course, were diagnosed with things and everything's their fault. If your child has some kind of psychiatric disorder, thank you very much. But for a while there, more than a century ago, there was a man who came up with a psychological diagnosis for slaves who tried to escape, who were going towards their freedom. That was a disorder. And then it was outlawed for a while it was. And I thought, that's no disorder. That's being a human being and the need to have a life, the need to be free. But even that was seen as somehow some pathology. We have a lot to learn still. I'm sure there's a lot of growth in our fields as well. And I'm wondering also, you were talking about, this story of people saying, well, I don't want to leave God, or I don't want you to leave God. this idea of leaving God, that if you're leaving a church, you're leaving God. Where does that come from? Because if you believe in God of the universe, God is everywhere, right? So how come he, she, whoever is just there?
Well, some of that comes from what I just said, that the Black church, the institution in and of itself, I kind of almost liken it to a womb, that so much was birthed out of, even people who are in the secular industry, a lot of them had their beginnings and cut their teeth in the church. So if, generationally, everything that we needed was in the church, when you leave, there is this fear and this notion that you're leaving God, but you're leaving community, you're leaving support, you're leaving everything that you would need is in this institution. And that's not true it shouldn't be true for any religion. And like, there's a whole world out there that is not dark and devilish and scary, but that's how it's presented. And some black churches and things of that nature. But it should not be that if you leave an institution, if you leave a community, if you leave a group, if you leave a relationship, that you now are leaving connection with God or higher power or your choice. It should not be that. But that is also an area that is hard for a lot of Black survivors when they leave out and they start trying to process some of this. There is that fear that still is connected with a lot of the indoctrination that you left God. You'll hear your mothers, the fathers, the grandmas, the matriarchs and patriarchs will point their finger and say, "I would have never thought you would have left God." This is what you hear. So you're already needing to process what has happened, the experiences that you had, but now the community is gone, And it's not just because you don't believe the same thing anymore necessarily. It's because of a lot of just these notions, these euphemisms that are often used. You're a heathen now, you're a reprobate. And I'm like, that's your daughter. How are you? But there is so much I often I want to talk more about this, what people do with their beliefs. What people do with their beliefs is sometimes it can just be really, really jarring, because just because that's your belief doesn't mean that's everyone else's belief. And how do you know that that's your belief? Because your grandma or your uncle or your mom, is it really yours? Or it was just put in your lap and you accepted it? Have you taken time to sift through? And that's what I also do with my clients. Okay, let's look at these beliefs when they're ready. If they're not, I know Dr. Yanya has her shelf that she uses a lot of times when the shelf breaks. But I've often talked about my life shelf, but from a different place. And this has helped me when was coming out of a lot of these spaces where there were a lot of topics, Rachel. I didn't know what to think about it. I didn't know what to think about the prophetic. I didn't know what to think about this belief and that belief. And in the beginning of my recovery, I had that watch on. I felt like I got to know all of this stuff. I got to know where I believe, where I stand. I got to have, I got to know this. And after a while, it was just breaking me. And I said, no, no, no. Let me take this watch off. Let me throw it away. And I'm just going to put these topics on a shelf and let them sit there. And when my nervous system is say, hey, it's okay. Let's take that topic off the shelf and let's process that topic. That's how I do it. And so when it comes to these beliefs, it may take time for survivors to actually really come and connect with themselves and say, you know what? I don't believe that. It's not serving me. It's very divisive. It's judgmental. I don't feel any love. I feel less of who I am when I hold on to this belief. I don't know what I will substitute it with, but that's okay. I just know I'm chucking this one. I'm getting rid of this belief right now. That I call it the proverbial spiritual hallway, where you're letting go, but you don't necessarily know what you're going to replace it with. And you're in that gray area where it's unknown, but it's okay, you know?
So many people will say, I believe such and such, but I also feel conflicted about it because I'm damning myself or I'm damning my brother who's gay, who I love, and I can't reconcile it with my conscience, but I'm still supposed to believe it. So, how do you then help people you're working with be able to know a little more closely what is their belief or not? Like how are they able to put it in the hallway, which I like. You're not kicking it out necessarily. It's just like, let's hang on for a sec. And it feels almost like they need to be given permission and to not feel panicked about, giving that up. And it's a whole process, isn't it?
It is because in a lot of these spaces, personal choice and agency and autonomy is removed. So part of that, swinging the pendulum, and I say slowly and being sensitive. You don't rush them into, okay, now what do you get a new house. What color do you want? I remember I couldn't even decide that for myself. I didn't know what color room I wanted. It was down to something as basic as that. It takes time to feel comfortable with, I had choice. Okay, I have choice. Okay, I have a whole lot of choices. That's overwhelming. Okay, let's just put two on the table. What do you think about, and really walking through processing some of these things. And it's okay if it takes you 2 months. I mean, it depends on what it is. If you got to get a bank account ASAP, and you might want to speed it up a little bit. But, if it's something as a matter of taste, or should I go back to school for this, or should I change careers? I mean, let's sit with this and helping them to feel okay with choice, with permission, and then with curiosity. Because in these spaces, you can't be curious. If you're curious, you are going down a hallway where the enemy will come and deceive you. So stay right in here in that groupthink arena. Stay right here where you have leaders that will think for you, and then you're safe. But when you come out, actually being curious can feel scary at first. But, I like to listen to my clients for when they are being curious or they're taking a risk and they don't even realize it. And it can be as small as, I never eat vanilla ice cream. I love chocolate the most, but today I just decided to get vanilla. I don't know why. And I mean, that can seem like, to them, they're just saying a story in the beginning when we open up session. And I'm like, wait. Did you hear yourself? You always used to take, chocolate ice cream, and you tried vanilla today. Like, yeah, well, what's up with that? Look at how you were able to take a risk. How did your body feel? How did you feel? It was like nothing. Uh-huh. So what does that look like to broaden that to bigger things, more important things you're still scratching your head on. And so, like I said, I like to sit with survivors and help them feel empowered and help them feel like they have choice and agency, because they do. To help them feel like they are their own guru, right? I'm not anti mentors or anti, I mean, you need that in life, right? But the balance is, after you hear all that, filter that through what you think, what you believe, how you see life, so that your own perspective is not overrode anymore by the guru or the apostle or the prophet. You are the guru. You have more inside of you, that wisdom box that is inside of you. I'm being metaphorically, speaking right now, but we don't realize what's inside of us oftentimes. And in a lot of these spaces, just basically frowns on them and makes it feel like, oh, it's dirty in there, it's nasty in there, it's a sinful nature. You got to get rid of it, don't connect with it. I say the opposite. There's resilience in there, there's beauty in there, there's wisdom in there. And I help them to trust in themselves, not Nikki, because Nikki's still healing. And I don't know you like you know you. But for some, it's the first time in their life that they've been able to start learning to connect with self. And I love that. I just enjoy that.
That's fantastic. I'm sure you're very skilled at what you do. And I love this idea too, that when people are leaning on you, you're wanting to give them their power back. Like, I think it sounds like you're willing to accept being this sort of transitional object, right? Like, okay, yes, you want to ask me my opinion. Okay, fine. But let's get to the point where you trust your own instincts, where you go within and you get to see that you can guide yourself well. And also, if you don't guide yourself perfectly and you make a mistake, okay, that's how you learn. Like, really, no harm, no foul, right?
Right, right. And understanding that at first, our bodies may not like that. The nervous system may feel like we know we're taking a risk, but our nervous system may feel, oh, what's going on? We don't like this, and being able to understand that, to understand our body is our friend, our emotions are messengers. They want to help us, and start to learn to understand, being able to step out and take a risk and sometimes doing it afraid. I've done that personally in certain areas of my life that 10 years ago I would have never thought I would have done it. And my nervous system was peaking a little bit, and I said, "It's okay. We're okay. At the end of the day, we can pull out of this if we don't like it. We can get our money back if we don't like it, but we're not recovery doesn't look like, or it shouldn't look like, I want to hide for the rest of my life because of what I've been through." Because then they still have some form of power over us. And I know it takes some time to get there, but for me, this is what I know about me. I'm supposed to shine. And I'm not saying that in a conceited way. I believe that about me. I did not believe that about myself years ago in these spaces. But my shining now is connecting with myself, liking myself, loving myself, being compassionate with myself, and then helping others to do the same thing. That's my shine. I can do that in a corner. I don't have to come on podcasts to do that. I can do that somewhere in the back, and I don't need the fanfare because going down that road is a whew. I don't want that. Like, I don't mind being in the back helping others, and watching them shine. But I think the travesty of going through all this and then hiding our light, hiding who we are, hiding our authentic self, and never taking risks because they took a lot of that from us. Let's reclaim that. Let's get some of that back to the measure that our bodies and lives are able to do that, because they are not the gurus of our lives. They might have tried to be that, but they're not. They're not. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. I know we're coming up towards the end of our time, and I want to shift gears for a moment and get a little political if we can. Right, because there's a lot happening out there that's really dicey, and you have some really important information to share. You mentioned something before we started recording about the NAR communities and Project 2025. So I know that could be a whole other show, but if you could kind of give us the, I don't know, overview, cliff notes, whatever it is, yeah, let people be familiar with what's happening.
Yes, yes. And if you would have me, I would love to come back.
Yeah,
Not to just be on the platform, but I think this is very important
yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
us in America right now, where we are at, and for people that work in the religious trauma space, cult space, and things of that nature. We've been seeing the writing on the walls for some years now. With our previous president and where things are kind of heading. But as I shared recently on another podcast, a lot of what I came out of, I talked a lot about the Black community, but I was also a part of, diverse cults, the ones I named earlier. Many of them were diverse. And I learned about a lot of the initiatives, if you will, that they claimed is on the heartbeat of God. And oftentimes, those initiatives did not include what was going on in Black America. It was usually what was going on in white America exclusively. But I came alongside, I lended my empathy and my heart and my intercession and said, okay, if it's on the heart of God, I want it to be on my heart. But I have been a part of, for many years when I was in these spaces, the pro life movement. I was involved in a lot of prayer rallies and prayer movements and how they've been strategizing to even get the country where it is at presently with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I was a part of communities where they had what they would call sieges, and they would send out prayer intercessors, and they would have life tape or red tape over their mouth with the word life on it, and they would have silent intercessions. They would stand out in front of a lot of the governmental buildings in Washington, D.C. They would stand in front of the Dallas courthouse in Dallas, Texas, because that's where Roe v. Wade was established. And they would not make a big fuss. They would pray silently, but then they would connect with lobbyists and connect with different politicians and So I am trying to condense this because you have communities, organizations like the Heritage Foundation, which is the biggest form of public policy, particularly for the conservative movement for decades. And what they have planned for the next president, and preferably a conservative, preferably if Trump wins a nomination, they have a whole initiative called Project 2025, which in essence would look like Christian nationalism 2.0, 5.0, 10.0. It would be an erosion of the three branches of government and how the powers have been balanced for decades and centuries. I believe Trump already eroded that when he was in office, but now they are looking to give the president the power to rule by executive orders only. They have so many initiatives in there that, in my opinion, it will affect every American. Whether you are in high school, they want to start because military enrollment is low. They want to start instituting part of the high school graduation. Part of that is to make sure that the students are filling out applications for military. Yes,
Whoa, to be
you can go.
drafted to wow. Wow.
Possibly. They have areas where if you are married, they want to go after the healthcare and how it is arranged with our employer. So if you are married, you get more benefits. If you are single, you get less. If you want to have a child, you want to have a baby or adopt, you get more benefits. If you don't, you have less. If people think that, and I didn't get a chance to really describe the cults I was in, but a lot of what I was in, a lot of the ideology, if people think, oh, that's those people on the documentary, I'm going to go and have my fishing trip and I'm okay. If they think that that is just them, I would love to come back and talk about this because what they are planning, it is not just them. My fear, and I hate to be pessimistic, is the cults that I'm a part of, the ideologies that I believe will be now what America looks like. And politics and the face of politics is just the face. Behind the scenes, it is about Christian nationalism. It is about dominionism. It is about something that they call within the NAR movement, New Apostolic Reformation, the Seven Mountain Mandate, which they believe that the spheres of this world, but particularly America, there's seven main ones that help influence society. You have the mountain of government, the mountain of family, the mountain of arts and entertainment, the mountain of education, the mountain of did I say finance? I might have said
Nope,
finance.
not yet.
There's a couple more, but
Mhm.
I'm religion, the mountain of religion, and they believe that these mountains have been taken over for decades by the secular community, that they're at the apex of the mountain, swaying society. And this new movement is a different arm of evangelicalism. It's a different arm of, Christianity, so to speak. So some people say, well, I'm a Christian. I don't know anything about it. They're not talking about you. These are the ones that believe Christianity as it's been is boring, it's tired, and God has initiatives that have to happen in this country. So they believe, as it is in heaven, so shall it be on earth, that the kingdom of God is at hand. And they believe that this community of apostles and prophets will be leading the charge to get his church from the bottom of these mountains of influence to flip it and be at the top of these mountains. And so this is why when Trump was a president, you had such a connection between a lot of the evangelicals and Trump because it was just a whole doorway. It was a filter to get a lot of what they wanted instituted in law. Because Trump did, in my opinion, he really didn't have an agenda, but they did. And so this is what they're planning on doing. In finance, what does that look like according to their manifesto? In Family Mountain is healthcare. It is sexual orientation. It is, the court system. What does it look like for them? In education, it is early childhood education is on the collegiate level. it is critical race theory. All of these things, they have initiatives to flip it. And Trump gave them, I call him like he was their Trojan horse because they've been planning this since Reagan, since both Bushes. But Trump had the personality. He had the I don't really care attitude. They didn't like his character, but they knew that he would be their battle ram to bust down the doors and let them come into power. I would love to go into this more because my fear is if he gets in office, number one, him personally, he will be in a retaliatory type of mode. He's coming back for everybody that says something about him,
Oh,
but that's
yeah.
him.
He's talked about revenge so much
Oh,
already.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But, and I can send you this article. I just read an article recently. I think it was in February where it talks about if he gets another term, he will want to infuse Christian nationalism into the fabric of American life. So there will be no place to so called run or hide from what they believe. And you can imagine, as a survivor of this, I'm ready to pull my hair like, no, but I know a lot of people, and this is not about politics telling people vote right or left. We're beyond this. This is not right or left. This is about authoritative democracy will be kind of on the outskirts. And this is about them setting up their agenda and it will be authoritative control. And you know what that's like in communities, let alone in an entire nation. And the kicker is, within these seven mountain NAR communities, their mindset is they believe God has delegated them to do this now, but they believe it's not enough for Texas to start looking that way or Florida to start looking that way. And then eventually America, they want to export this ideology globally because in their mind, just like a Christian would go across the street and evangelize to their neighbor, they feel that God has mandated them to evangelize the nations with this ideology. It's already been happening, but if he were to get back into a second term, what that would look like would be horrific.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. So this is chilling.
I didn't want to scare the listeners, but
No,
I think we
no.
got to wake up. I know that
Yes.
politics is like we're jaded and we're tired and no one's looking forward to an election year, but I really implore you, if you are able, look up Project 2025. They have it all out there on Front Street because in their mind this will be accomplished no matter what.
Incredible. I mean, the separation of church and state will be over.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes.
And sort of what our founding fathers wanted doesn't matter, really.
Right. Right. And I've been in communities where they talked about that a lot at the services and our founding fathers and the Constitution when I was in those spaces. And I'm like, what are y'all doing now? How did you go from that to total dominion? But they feel that this is the mandate that God has given them to take dominion. And they get that from the book of Genesis. But that's not what it means. But this is their interpretation that they want to spread here and abroad. So,
Yeah, no, it's not about scaring listeners at all. It's about informing. It's a way to respond to when people say, "How come I didn't see this coming?" Or if I had known, I would have maybe tried to do something about it. I mean, yes, people have their blinders on. And I think it's made that way intentionally. Things are being stirred up in the shadows. I think when you have a culture where people are kind of triggered to be pitted against each other, then everyone's distracted, fighting with each other, and then people can come in and do their thing. And that happens in a lot of places. That happened in Ukraine, whatever, and the Russians came in. I mean, it happened. So I would love to have you back to talk about that, really get into it. And that would be amazing. That would be amazing. It is so good to talk to you today. I know we could talk about each of these subjects for so long. And so the fact though that you are out there sharing this information is so vital. Can you let people know where to find your podcast and
yes.
everything else? Yeah.
Yes. So you can find me on my website, NikkiGspeaks.com. All my social media are on that website. And then the Surviving the Black Church podcast. I am a co-host. Two other of my friend colleagues, my friend Jonathan Carrington, he's a therapist, and crisis counselor Hugh is another friend of mine, and we just kind of have these conversations. We did season one. We're working on season two. We're going to bring some guests on and really go deeper in conversation of. And the podcast is not. It's called Surviving the Black Church, and we're not looking to go against the institution of the Black church. We're not there to tear it down. We understand its origins and community. But with our community, you have to meet them halfway. You can't just, they will totally just check out. But we're having conversations, and the podcast is geared towards survivors of the Black church. So we have that. But we also just started in November something called the Black Religious Trauma Recovery Network. And our first offering is on the second and fourth Thursday of every month. We have a free space where survivors in the Black community, or those who are our allies that want to get involved, that want to know more, can come. And we just have conversations. I think the last one we talked about what does spiritual parenting look like in the Black community, spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers, and how they abuse. And people get to come, share their stories, be strengthened, supported. And that is our first offering under our network. We have a whole lot more that we're going to do with that network, but we at least wanted to connect with the listeners of the podcast and give them space to share. So those are the two areas that we offer support. And if you want one-on-one coaching, you can find me on my website. So yeah.
Nice. You're a busy woman.
Yeah.
doing a lot of really important things. So thank you for your time today. I truly love it. And we will definitely have you back on.
Yes, I would love to come back.
One more thing before you go. It's so interesting to speak to Nikki G. It is really amazing to hear about her experiences and to hear about what she has to say about emotions being our messengers, that they're trying to help us, that they're trying to guide us. So much of what happens when people are in groups similar to Nikki G's is that they learn to ignore their emotions. They learn to not hear the messages and the messengers of these emotions. They learn to disengage from them. It seems somehow of value in a lot of cultic groups to not have negative emotions. You can have positive ones, but you can't get angry and you can't feel sad. You can't feel resentful. You're not allowed to get jealous. You're not allowed to have so many very human emotions. And so what I think furthers this kind of disengagement from emotion is this idea of spiritual bypassing. So she talked about the idea of forgiveness being a way to spiritually bypass accountability. It's a great phrase, and I agree with it. This is something that I've talked about on the podcast in the past, that there is a value placed on forgiving people. And I think if it can be seen as part of your healing, then sure. But I do think that if you're asked to forgive or told you have to forgive, then that doesn't really address the lingering emotions you have about something that may have happened to you that was truly wrong. It also doesn't address the fact that the person then who did something to you is not going to have to pay a price for it. They might not even be talked to about it. They might not have to take any responsibility, not even to acknowledge it. And so I do think, again, if forgiving someone is something that helps you and helps you move on, great, then do it. But I do think that it's much more meaningful and much more powerful, makes a lot more sense, and incorporates the other person in your forgiveness when you say, I will forgive you, but based on merit, based on how you are responding to the fact that I am bringing to your attention that you did something wrong or you did something wrong to me. If somebody apologizes, if someone makes a promise to not do this thing again that they've done that hurt you, if you also see changed action, then I think it feels a lot better to forgive someone based on that, but that they need to participate in it in order for it to really be meaningful. What's also true is that when we talk about spiritually bypassing in your life, there are a lot of phrases that people are becoming more aware of, but you might not know what that means. So I wanted to spend a moment just giving some examples of what spiritual bypassing looks like. One of the ways that people within groups or spiritual groups are taught to deal with things is actually to become highly detached, to seem like they're kind of skimming the surface of reality, not really feeling what's happening around them, not really seeming like they care, but kind of floating above the ground or seeming almost like they're a hologram in their lives. And that this keeps people calm, keeps people wrinkle-free, and keeps people really kind of feeling good, calm in their lives. But I don't think it's a way to actually feel truly alive and truly able to react to your life. The other part is having to deny your emotions, bypassing difficult emotions, really difficult ones. Like somehow you're not supposed to be feeling this way. You're not supposed to be having a hard time because that might mean something bad about you or something weak about you or something unholy about you. Another spiritual bypass is to be able to really have this feeling of entitlement. Because I have found it, or because I am a leader within this community, I deserve to have good things happen to me. I can feel superior. And I know that you're not supposed to feel pride in a lot of religious organizations, but still, there are some people who are able to spiritually bypass actual true emotion just because they feel superior and entitled, kind of emotionally protected, emotionally greater than the people around them. Then there are some other examples of just being very controlling, being controlling of yourself and controlling of others, being a rule follower to a great extent, following the formulas that you're given. And in that way, you will feel that if you follow it just right, everything will work out just right. And God will reward you. And so you don't have to feel worried and you don't have to feel sad. And all of those emotions go away just because you have followed things in an excessively controlling way. And that does include controlling others around you, which can sometimes make you feel superior, sometimes make you feel entitled to being rewarded. The other kind of spiritual bypassing that I think is really, truly dangerous is this idea of justifying suffering. That somehow you justify your own suffering or you justify the suffering of others. This is something that I hear about almost all the time. That it's for people's own good or it's a way for them to show growth. In some of these groups where they are giving you these pseudo-scientific miracle cures and your symptoms are getting worse, or you're starting to have symptoms that really are troubling, or you break out into a rash or whatever it is, they will justify your suffering. Well, that's because the toxins that we're helping you release are coming to the surface. Or the reason that we don't have to apologize for the suffering we're causing to you is because we're helping you. We're helping you go through a corrective experience. We're helping you with your karma. This is supposed to teach you a lesson. It's another way of just justifying people's pain and what they're going through. And then it also, unfortunately, pushes people to disengage from their own pain, not get help, not get therapy, not go see a real doctor, not have their symptoms alleviated because somehow these negative symptoms are helping them. And then another spiritual bypass is to repress everything, to repress your drives, to repress your emotions, to repress your instincts, to repress your decision-making, to repress your attachments to people. And in that way, you stay seemingly unaffected by things happening around you, which is also something that, while in the moment feels like a relief, it can be destructive in the long run, because the longer people spend disengaged from their life and from their emotions, the more they start to fear having an emotion. They have gone through now a lot of time of not learning how to address them, not learning how to manage them, but instead learning how to run from them. And when you've spent so much time running from something, you can be truly afraid of it after a while, being convinced somehow that it's going to overtake you, it's going to overwhelm you, and that you need to stay in this kind of secure place with armor on so that you don't truly feel. But again, that takes you out of your life. It takes you out of feeling pain, but it also takes you out of feeling joy. It takes you out of feeling. One of the things that I think is important, though, to think about is that when you are spiritually bypassing, especially going back to this idea of forgiveness, it prevents you from acknowledging what you're feeling. It distances you from yourself and from others. And it also pushes you to avoid feelings of anger. And then you can hide from that pain. But sometimes those feelings, the anger, the sadness, as uncomfortable as they are our guide. They are our safety net. They help us know something happened that was wrong. And without that as a gauge, then the people around you who have hurt you get away with it. And that's dangerous. People who love being able to be part of a system where they can get away with things know that if the system is set up that way, then they can continue getting away with things. And it creates more of a monster, really. It creates more entitlement to mistreat. I don't want anyone to be a part of a system like that. Because at the end of the day, it really actually hurts the perpetrator who's not learning anything and is not being encouraged to grow or to show self-control or to learn how to have it. And it especially hurts the victim. So I want you to make sure, as much as you can, to not be part of a system that teaches you to avoid what you should be feeling and teaches you to be afraid of your feelings. Talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.